Welcome everyone. On behalf of Penn Sustainability, I would like to welcome you all to our panel titled Nature as Nurture. My name is Natalie Walker, and I am the Sustainability Manager with Penn Sustainability. This event is hosted by the Sustainability Office at Penn in collaboration with our speakers from Penn's Urban Health Lab, UC Green, and Overbrook Environmental Education Center. The event is also part of and sponsored by the University of Pennsylvania's Climate Week, and it's also part of Penn Sustainability's Rethink Your Footprint campaign, where we welcome the Penn community to think deeply about their impact on and connection with the environment. A special thank you to Simon Richter for his work in organizing Climate Week, and we encourage you all to continue to explore the event's calendar as part of this week. This event will be recorded, and we ask that you keep your video and microphone muted throughout the program. Before beginning our panel today, we would like to acknowledge that the lands that the University of Pennsylvania occupies, and from which I'm speaking to you today, are the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. I would like to ask you to join me in honoring the original caretakers of the land and recognizing the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that has brought our institution and ourselves here. We know that the United States was founded through violent dispossession of land from indigenous peoples, and this kind of violence has persisted throughout history and remains today. Studies show that fewer natural places are located in places where Black, Latino, and Asian American people live, and environmental injustices like air and water pollution are disproportionately concentrated in communities of color. We also see examples of violence in Christian Cooper, a Black man who had the police called on him while white women were birdwatching in Central Park, and Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered while jogging outside in Georgia. Access to nature, including access to clean water, air, and time outside, is not an amenity, it's a necessity. So today we have an engaging discussion with three panelists who will share why nature is so important to us as humans and explain their work to improve access to nature for all. I'm so pleased to welcome our panelists for today, Dr. Gina South, Faculty Director of the Urban Health Lab and Assistant Professor of Emergency Medicine at the Perelman School of Medicine, Keisha Hewling, Director of UC Green, and Jerome Shabazz, Executive Director of Overbrook Environmental Education Center. I will introduce each of our panelists to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, so please type your questions that you have into the chat box throughout the presentation. We'll be keeping track of them, and we'll go through your questions after we've heard from each of the panelists. With that, I am pleased to introduce our first panelist today, Dr. Gina South. Dr. South has dedicated her career to improving the health and well-being of the urban poor. As an emergency physician, she provides care for a diverse population with complex medical problems and witnesses firsthand how neighborhood environments impact health. As a researcher, Dr. South works to identify and address upstream causes of poor health. She's interested in understanding the ways in which the physical and social attributes of where people live, work, and play influence cardiovascular and mental health, chronic stress, and violent crime. She develops and tests neighborhood-level, place-based, and person-based interventions. Dr. South has worked on a series of studies evaluating the impact of vacant lot greening and violent crime, perceptions of safety, physiologic stress, and mental health. Thank you, Dr. South, for being here with us today, and now I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Natalie and Elizabeth, thank you for organizing this panel. And Keisha and Jerome, it's a pleasure to be on this panel with you today, and I look forward to hearing from you both. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about nature and health and sort of laying the groundwork for what we know about those links. I'm very passionate about dismantling structural and institutional racism through research and action. I would say that's sort of what drives my career, both as a physician and a researcher and an advocate and activist. The premise of my work, and I think of what a lot of what we're talking about here today, is that the places that we live, our neighborhoods, play an integral role in our ability to be healthy. When you think about in Philadelphia, there is up to a 20-year life expectancy gap between the neighborhood in Philly with the highest life expectancy and the neighborhood in Philly with the lowest life expectancy. That's 20-year difference for neighborhoods that are just maybe a mile apart. And so when you think about that, first of all, that's astounding and very alarming. But when you think about, why is that, and you start to really ask questions about why and really get under the hood of that, we really come to our neighborhoods in this country being defined by racial and economic segregation, really racial segregation and income inequality. And that has to do, that plays into our neighborhood environments. And this is not an accident. The way that our neighborhoods are shaped, including neighborhood environments and things like nature, which I'm going to get to in a minute, but the way our neighborhoods are shaped is the result of choices that we have made in this country and policies and practices over generations that have resulted in our present day conditions. And so just to sort of touch on some of that briefly, the issue of redlining, which I think has in recent months gotten a lot more attention. I think a lot more people are aware of this. But redlining was a federal government policy that basically determined what neighborhoods would have access to mortgages and capital in order to buy homes, and determined who got to live where. Of all, this is not a lecture on redlining, but of all of the mortgages that people were able to get through the Federal Housing Administration, which was created as part of the New Deal, 98% of them went to white households. And so basically cutting off everyone who was not white from access to capital, access to buy homes, which in turn plays into the ability to invest in your neighborhood in a variety of ways. Shifts in the job landscape, so the loss of manufacturing jobs in cities resulted in population decline in cities over, from the 1950s until the 2000s. But the people who were able to leave cities and go to suburbs were predominantly white for many of the reasons laid out with redlining and other just policies and practices determining sort of who's able to move where. Again, all of this has led to the wealth gap that we see between white and Black households, which is for every dollar that white households have, Black households in this country have about 6 or 7 cents, which again plays into the ability of people to invest in their neighborhoods. So, we can't talk about nature without thinking about some of those structural causes of why our neighborhoods look the way they do. And then specifically when we think about nature, as Natalie mentioned, nature and access to nature is not evenly spread out. You can look at something like tree canopy. Tree canopy in this city and many cities across the country, you have a gap based on neighborhood income, where trees are located and where they're not. And trees are not just a nice to have amenity. They have very concrete benefits to health, including temperature. So there can be up to a 20-degree temperature differential within a city on any given day based on where trees are located. And that has direct health impacts. And we think about parks, where parks are located, and then not just where parks are located, but clean and safe parks. So the quality of parks and where they're located. So when I think about nature, I really think that nature is an underutilized community health tool, both from the standpoint of creating a more equitable distribution of access to green space, but also from a healthcare provider standpoint. We think about exercise, for example, as being really important for health, and exercise is something that's talked about in primary care visits. I think nature should be talked about in that same way. So I think it really is an underutilized tool to promote health and well-being in communities. So just what does the research and literature tell us about nature and health? I'm going to go through a couple things and use some of my own research as an example. So there's, I think about the literature between nature and health in sort of three buckets. So the first is a lot of literature showing that having more green space in your living environment is good for your health across a range of outcomes, thinking about hypertension, mental health diagnoses such as depression, pregnancy outcomes like lower rates of preterm birth. I am involved in a study that is being led by a medical student where we looked at, in Philadelphia, the location of trees, so tree canopy, and looking at hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, which is ranging from gestational hypertension to preeclampsia that women can develop when they're pregnant, all of which contribute to maternal morbidity and mortality. And we found that that women with more tree canopy around where they live, in the immediate environment of where they live, had lower odds of developing hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. This is, of course, an association. It's not a causation. And a lot of the literature in this category is associational. And there are confounders, but to the best of our ability, sort of in statistical models, we account for all of that. I was also involved in a study where we looked at tree canopy and the location of where predominantly young Black men were assaulted with guns. And we found that tree canopy was actually protective for being assaulted, and particularly in leaf growing season. So not when there are not leaves on the trees, but when there are. And there are a lot of reasons for that, one of which may be the relationship between trees and green space and reduced stress and increased social connections. So that's one bucket. Another bucket, there's a lot of studies showing the immediate benefits of spending time in green space. So for example, I conducted a study where we had people walk past vacant lots before and after they were greened, and we had people wear heart rate monitors, using heart rate as sort of a marker of acute stress. And we found that heart rate was significantly lower when people were walking past the green spaces compared to before they were green and compared to spaces that were never greened at all. And so there is sort of an immediate physiologic connection that happens when we are in green space. There was a really cool study that looked at people's tweets when they were about to go into park spaces and when they were in parks. And they found that people's tweets were basically happier. People were happier in their tweeting when they were about to go into a green space or when they were in a green space compared to when they were not. And then finally, there was an interesting study where they had people walk in nature and also walk in a built environment that didn't have nature. And they actually then put them in an MRI machine and to look at blood flow in their brain. And they found that there was less blood flow after a walk in green space to the part of the brain that controls rumination, which is sort of like a negative thought pattern that we can all get into at times. And so they found, again, physiologic evidence in the brain of a healthier thought pattern when you're in green space. And then finally, the experimental evidence. Experimental evidence is sort of the highest level of evidence, the highest level of scientific certainty. And there are not many experimental studies related to green space and health. But two of the things that I'll tell you about, one I was not directly involved with. A group of researchers, including folks from the University of Pennsylvania, looked at tree loss, and I believe it was in Ohio, and they looked at when trees were infested and died as a result of like insect infestation. They looked to see what happened when you lost trees compared to communities that didn't lose trees, and they actually found a rise in crime in communities that lost trees compared to communities that did not lose trees. And so that was really interesting evidence. And then finally, I, along with Charlie Brannis at Columbia, John McDonald, and Doug Wiebe here at the University of Pennsylvania, was involved in a large randomized controlled trial of vacant lot greening in the city. And just to tell you about that briefly, this was really innovative and exciting because normally when we think about randomized controlled trials, we think about randomizing people to get different interventions. So you think about, a drug trial. People are randomized to either get drug A or drug B. So what we did is we actually randomized places. So we randomized places that had vacant lots to get either a greening intervention that is done by the Pennsylvania Horticulture Society that involves clearing the space, planting new grass, trees, and a low wooden post and rail fence around the edge. They got that, or a trash intervention where just the trash was picked up every 2 weeks, or no intervention. And what we found was that violent crime, went down around lots that received any intervention. When we looked at neighborhoods below the poverty line, so sort of the most struggling and hard-hit neighborhoods in our city, that's where we saw the biggest impact. Violent crime went down up to 29% in those neighborhoods. We also found that people that lived nearby who did not know that we were involved in the intervention reported socializing more with neighbors, going outside more to hang out. So again, that connection between the environment and how people relate to each other and their experience with people in their neighborhood. And then we also found around green lots that people who lived near those lots reported feeling less depressed. So a connection between the environment and creating a greener environment and improvements in mental health. So I'm gonna stop there. There's much more that one could talk about, but I think the point is that we know that green spaces are healthy. We have a lot of evidence, and there's more research to be done in this area, but I think we can no longer think about nature and green space as nice to have amenities. They are vital for thinking about community health and supporting communities and being healthy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. South, for speaking to us about how important our neighborhoods are and the environment in our neighborhoods are to human health and the policies that have shaped them over time. So I'm so excited to introduce our second panelist for today, Keisha Hewling. Keisha serves as the director for UC Green, which is a West-Southwest Philadelphia local community greening organization established in 1998. And through collaboration with residents and universities, the organization has mobilized thousands of volunteers in planting 4,000 trees in the 19139, 19143, and 19104 area codes. As a graduate of Temple University and the University of Pennsylvania's School for Social Policy and Practice, Keisha is a disciplined advocate for healthy communities. With a professional background in research, public health, and community engagement, she steered action toward equitable greening, education, and policy that's rooted in community-led volunteerism, social justice, and civic partnership. Thank you, Keisha, for being here with us today, and now I will turn it over to you.
Hi, it's great to be talking with you all. Gina made some really wonderful points. I want to tell you a little bit about UC Green and what we do, and then to kind of piggyback on some of Dr. South's great points around healthy communities and the importance of fostering those healthy communities, thinking about greenness beyond just an aesthetic of like an attractive community, but also that it indicates thriving communities. So UC Green in its 22 years has planted trees. The important and valuable part for us has been how we plant those trees. And so our model is one that is essentially neighbors planting trees for neighbors. And so it incorporates a huge amount of volunteerism, whether it is university students, local civic groups, individual neighbors that sign up to volunteer with us for our twice-a-year tree. It creates an opportunity to connect and build a stronger community amongst volunteers. We, outside of a pandemic, we have a celebratory meetup, and we're able to talk and to introduce ourselves to one another. You meet a neighbor from up the street, you meet someone who went to your high school, you meet a University of the Sciences student or a Chase Bank employee who is volunteering and works in the community but doesn't necessarily live in the community. And so through those things, you're able to foster some social cohesion. And these teams subsequently plant trees in front of the homes of neighbors who have opted for a tree. And so that in and of itself is an element of fostering closer and closer knit communities through volunteerism. It's something that we really pride ourselves in, not only just planting at an impactful scale in West and Southwest Philadelphia, but doing that with the notion of community in mind. But what I want to talk to you all today about are some of the barriers in access to green spaces, but primarily barriers in access to trees. I know that for some time, the element of outreach or the element of engagement in encouraging folks to plant trees has been this frequent conversation around education and what you don't know about the value of trees. And what I've found and what UC Green has set out to quantify beyond just personal antidote is that our neighbors, and especially in West and Southwest Philadelphia, they get the value of trees. They understand the value of canopy, the shade, the lowering of cooling costs. They understand heat island effect. They experience heat island effect oftentimes. And so are able to identify that, yes, I am a less affable person. I am drained during hot summer days because there are not enough trees around here to even buffer our concrete environment from the sun. And so they do, my neighbors and the community that I serve does have an understanding where we see that there aren't trees. There are some things that are not just an I don't like tree issue. There's certainly some of that, but there are other built environment issues that prevent folks from prevent them in opting for a tree. And those are things that, to speak to Gina's point, and something that we all kind of know and consider, they are issues around economics. They are financial barriers. They are issues around discrimination and neglect in some communities. And so very specifically, what I have experienced is that there are built environment and barriers, such as in order for a tree to be planted, there has to be a tree pit, and that tree pit has to be prepped and ready to receive a tree. And so if there's a stump in the tree pit, there's a cost to remove that stump. And that cost might not be something that a fixed income homeowner, a new homeowner, for whatever reason, a property owner may not be able to take on. Oftentimes in the permitting process for street trees, which is what UC Green plants, there is always an assessment of the sidewalk. And so cracks in the sidewalk can be a reason why a site is declined for a tree. And that is then on the homeowner's responsibility, or it's the homeowner's responsibility to repair that sidewalk. Oftentimes we see these conversations around right tree and right location. And so a home may want a tree at one location that might be in front of a stop sign. And so that house is denied a tree, and the conversation extends down the block. We can't have trees on this block, but it's really just a right tree and right location. And so we also find that there's a lot of those right-of-way issues like signage that will impede tree planting on some of our more densely populated blocks. And our more densely populated blocks are often in our lower income community. Lastly, one significant barrier is the Philadelphia carriage block, which for a lot of residents is almost your favorite block that you want to live on. It's the blocks that are so small and so kind of intimate that doesn't allow for the 3 feet of walking. There has to be a 3-foot walking path, and then there also has to be 3 feet or 3 by 3 for a minimum size tree pit. And so you'll see blocks that are so small, it's the little blocks where you can barely get a car down the street. Those blocks by right cannot have a tree because their walking path is not a minimum of 6 feet. And so you find that those are blocks also. And we see this frequently in Cobbs Creek. As we head up towards the park, the streets get smaller, they're more densely populated. And so those blocks by permit and by design are blocks that simply cannot have trees because they're so densely populated. Our work at UC Green is to identify these built environment barriers, to problem solve with residents, and to advocate on their behalf. for some solutions to increase the access of trees. And so if that looks like advocating for some stump removal or finding a lower no-cost service to remove the stump so that a resident can have a tree where they otherwise would not incur that expense, that's what we work with several partners and our neighbors to facilitate, to increase that access and to minimize that barrier. In addition to the initial things that will prevent receiving a tree, there's additionally some things for consideration around the cost of maintaining a tree. And what often happens is folks are thinking ahead, as as one will do as a property owner, and you think ahead about the expenses. This is going to be loud. Think ahead about the expenses that come along with maintaining a tree, and down the road, if a tree should fall, who is responsible for it? If the city decides that they have to do some maintenance work, and there's a little bit of like backfill that's dumped on a newly established tree, and that ultimately kills the tree, who is responsible for those trees? Those questions very thoughtfully come up in conversations as we plan tree planting with our neighbors. And one of the things that we also work to do in that instance is to be very transparent about communicating where liability falls for property owners, what sources of relief there are, what is your recourse and what steps to take whenever something that essentially sits on the street side but is your responsibility might not be as safe as you would want it to be. And so oftentimes neighbors talk about 311 calls and saying, I told 311 that this tree needed work, and that it looked like it was on decline, and now it's dead altogether. And so we work with them to talk about the system itself, where it has its strengths and its flaws, but also, again, to advocate for some of those outcomes so that things are less burdensome for people and people feel more comfortable in opting for a tree, with a mindfulness that there is an expense. And I think that is the issue, is that households are thinking about planting a tree as an expense and not as an essential amenity, an essential part of a healthy community, something that indicates that their block is well and thriving. There's often this conversation around trees being a luxury and an expense, right? And so this is frequently in several, at the community level, at a policy level, and in academia. These are conversations that UC Green really works to bring some heightened awareness to. The final barrier in access that we think about, that I think is very important whenever we talk about feeling a connection to your sense of home. A lot of times people plant trees as placemaking. You buy a new house, you plant a tree, you have these tree memories. You remember the oak tree in a relative's yard as you were growing up. And so oftentimes people will want to plant a tree. In the city of Philadelphia, only homeowners can opt for a tree. And what we see, we've seen for years now, is that Philadelphia is moving to being more renter occupied. And even if it wasn't a majority renter occupied city, in general, you have to appeal to your landlord or the property owner to then allow you, a person who has made home at a residence, to opt for a tree. And at the city level, the only person that can sign off on street tree planting is the property owner. This is a barrier in getting trees planted. It is something that does not honor the rights of people to make home, to opt for a healthier environment for whatever reasons in their community, on their block. but also in thinking about systems, it is it's a mechanism of liability and responsibility. And so this is something that we have worked to raise an awareness on, to encourage policy, to encourage thinking that moves away from this owner-only option for trees. It is not something that is going to serve the city going forward. And when we think about the opportunities to plant trees and how many people are willing to participate in community, care for a tree, would want a tree, understand the value of that tree in a healthy environment and in a thriving community, and then the barrier for them is home ownership. It's a direction that we are eager to see the city correct on. And so as an access issue, that is a huge undertaking, and it's something to consider. So I've reviewed, and I'll just recap. There is, in our experience, especially planting in West and Southwest, and especially with years of just a wonderful tradition of planting trees, there is interest and there is investment there. UC Green has planted trees because of the interest of residents. And so the notion of folks don't understand and they need to be educated on buy-in, in order to have buy-in around trees, that is less accurate in our experience and in my experience when compared to there's certainly interest, but there are barriers and there is risk in opting for a tree. There's systems we need to address. That the onus to overcome that really doesn't lie in our residents, it lies in our systems. And so UC Green serves to stand in and to facilitate and do some problem solving there. But that is effective, also reactionary and at times ad hoc. And so our next step is to evaluate these systems that put burden on homeowners, on residents, on neighbors, on volunteers who want healthier environments, but seem to have to navigate a system that may not be supportive of that. That's it.
All right. Thank you so much, Keisha, for speaking with us about UC Green's greening efforts and how they create community connectivity and the barriers to access to trees, and how UC Green is serving the community in solving some of those problems. So thank you. I just want to have one reminder to everyone that we are taking questions after we hear from Jerome. We'll be taking questions. So if you have questions for our speakers, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we will ask them after we hear from Jerome. So I'm happy to introduce our third panelist to you today, Jerome Shabazz. Jerome is the founder and the executive director of Jazz Tech Development Services, Inc. It's a not-for-profit organization developed in 1998 to promote environmental justice, encourage sustainable design, and to ensure public health resources in urban communities. In 2002, Jazz Tech applied for and received the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency grant under the Clean Water Act to establish the Overbrook Environmental Education Center, or OEEC, a community-based center dedicated to preserving our built and natural environments. And under Mr. Shabazz's direction, the OEEC completed a targeted brownfield assessment and remediated environmental hazards from a brownfield site in Western Philadelphia. The site is now the OEEC's educational facility and has trained thousands of students on the Clean Water Act, Toxic Substances Control Act, and other topics that reduce human health exposure to harmful substances at home and school. The OEEC is nationally known for its environmental justice, project-based learning programs. Mr. Shabazz is a member of the PA Department of Environmental Protection's Citizen Advisory Council, Environmental Justice Advisory Council, National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, Center of Excellence in Environmental Toxicology at University of Pennsylvania, and is a board member for Keep Pennsylvania Beautiful. Mr. Shabazz has a Master's of Science degree in Environmental Protection and Safety Management from St. Joseph's University and has received numerous citations and awards for his work in environmental justice and community development. So thank you, Jerome, for being here with us today, and now I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, Natalie and Elizabeth and the whole sustainability team at Penn. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak along with our wonderful co-presenters. I could have listened all afternoon to Dr. South and Keisha. They have such compelling work that they do. So I'm like happy to be a part of the conversation, but equally so, I appreciate that they are talking about some of the systemic problems that we have with connecting people to the environment. When we talked about this initial topic, we had this working theme called nature as nurture. And, for me, the center and what we do is connected to that. And so, as the executive director of a not-for-profit organization, the Overbrook Center is a subsidiary of a broader nonprofit called Jazz Tech Development Services, Inc. We started out in 1998 as a community-based center for improving the quality of life, literacy, and environmental and public health for citizens in Philadelphia. But much of the work that I do today is really people-centric. We started out looking at the environmental impacts of our communities, and we realized that we were able to develop tremendous data on epidemiology and impact and effects and industrial waste and its connection to our public health. But we were getting away from the idea of the human-centric components of all of the work. And so in my early years, I started reflecting back on my early years. And I realized that my parents were probably my first conservationists and environmentalists. I grew up in North Philadelphia. And recently when I was reflecting on my childhood, I realized that, there were values that we were able to embrace around people wiping their feet before they went into the house and washing your hands and before you went into the refrigerator. And I started thinking about these values. They were sort of neighborhood norms. We had these weekly cleanups and the entire neighborhood block by block, wash down the stoop and wash down the pavements and scrub the pavements. And I started thinking about how we were creating competitions around who had these most beautiful blocks, and everybody was proud of their part of maintaining that sort of neighborhood norm around making sure that the environment didn't have an adverse effect on our health. And so academically now, when I talk with my colleagues, we all are sort of aware of how we need to prevent exposures and to some of these sort of vector diseases and these domestic toxins, and particularly now when we talk about COVID and all of the impacts of how we are transferring bacteria and environmental conditions from one person to another, from one surface to another. All of these types of impacts on people, it sort of grows out of a perspective by which we understand our relationship to the environment. So a great deal of my work is talking about not only the fact that we've had a history within neighborhoods, at the community level of people being aware of environmental impacts, but I want to also talk about the social architecture for interfacing people and having a relationship with people, environment, and the society. And so one of the projects that we've created at the Overbrook Environmental Education Center was an educational component that talks about the social architecture for sustainable and resilient communities. And the purpose for developing this social architecture is to get beyond what I call the 1.0 of the chapter. The 1.0 is identifying the science of how we're being impacted. And the 2.0 is what do we need to know about that and how it's affecting us. And most importantly, what can we do about it? So the social architecture for these resilient and sustainable communities are built upon some fundamental principles of inclusion, of equity, of prosperity and trust and justice. At the heart of my work, I like to think of myself as an advocate for environmental justice. And what that means essentially is helping to prevent or creating this prophylactic that prevents vulnerable communities from being excessively burdened with and by environmental conditions and environmental impacts. And so we have to go at environmental affairs and from such a perspective that we don't just treat it as if this is a repository for something that we'll do until greater development takes place. When we started out our work about 22 years ago, when people entertained the idea of maintaining open space, it was never for the purposes of it being consistent or contiguous. It was only a temporary thing. So you have this tension even today where there are people who will work on lots and they'll put up urban gardens and farmsteads and grow trees just to have a developer come behind it and take it over and undo everything that's been done. And that lack of inequity is only as a result of the lack of value that we've been able to establish for maintaining green space as a natural, normal, valuable part of our social construct. And I think that the work that we've tried to demonstrate at the Overbrook Environmental Education Center was just about that. The Overbrook Center, we developed it in 2002. It was a former Brownsville site and had about 40 tons of trash that we had to maintain and eliminate, to do assessments. We had to do the phase 1 and phase 2 and the TBA assessments for all of the work that needed to be done. But the bigger part of our work was how we engaged and included the community within it. And what we were able to find is that, areas such as safety and security and well-being became as much a part of the discussion with the community as the beauty and the aesthetic value of having greener spaces within the neighborhood. And so, the bigger emphasis of my work today is to talk about the intersectionality of what green space can do for our health, what it can do for the well-being of not only our built and natural environments, but what it does for the well-being of the people that live within it. We talk about green space, but what we're really looking at is the opportunity for green space to have an identity of its own. And we're talking about green space as a system, and we have to look at our systems in such a way where we value them relative to our public health. We were doing some epidemiology work with some universities in the city. We found that at least 1 of every 5 citizens that we surveyed had a health condition that was either remediated by their exposure to the environment or to the foods that they ate. And so, we started looking at what are some of the remedies for these health conditions that would enable the citizen to get upstream and to manage their own care in a more effective way. And it was always about 3 very simple but very complicated things for them to do: to get greater exercise, become more food literate, and have access to healthier foods. And so when we talk about, mitigating obesity and diabetes and hypertension, and the great doctor can talk more explicitly about these factors, but having access to the remedial conditions that will help improve those health disparities are part of a new normal that our organization attempts to establish. that we want it to be normal that you can walk down the block and someone takes consideration for the kinds of cement and concrete that may be interfering with a senior person being able to walk within the neighborhood for a quarter of a mile. We want to look at encouraging people to become aware of the air quality inside and outside of their homes so that they can mitigate issues around asthma and other kinds of respiratory duress that impact in their lives, and have them understand what kind of things may be taking place within the home that you're bringing from outside without the proper cleaning and without the proper home care that can enable you to reduce not only the aggravation of these disorders, but to enable you to have a healthier and more vibrant lifestyle. And so for us, it's a connection between the built and natural environments. It is our ability to be able to demonstrate this work and engage our community around it, which is the greatest part of our success and our advocacy. One of the greatest areas of pride for us is that we have community members who, in this post-industrial neighborhood in West Philadelphia, who had decided over time that they did not see a safe place for them to be able to walk along the commercial corridor, even to exercise, who are now rethinking that, who are now saying, I can, for the first time, walk past this area of my neighborhood and enables me to take a quarter or eighth of a mile walk and feel safe and comfortable. So we know that the built environment and the natural environments have to be in sync with one another. I want to do more around the idea of creating an interpretive model that enables for developers and for city makers and for planners, governmental leaders to realize that our open space is not just a repository until the developer can build something on it, but it's a necessary part of our neighborhood's design and structure, and that we should preserve it. You know, when you look at the intersecting values, we realize that climate change, particularly in our region, is going to be most greatly impacted through extreme heat and through excessive water, and it's going to affect every other aspect of our environment in terms of air quality, the changes in vector ecology, the changes in food and water supplies and the impacts around it. This kind of intersectionality is something that we absolutely want to do a better job of sharing with the neighborhood person, the common person, the person who is not the scientist, the person who is not the academic, but the citizen that we all love and know and care. And I have this great affinity for, because I'm a lifelong Philadelphian, and I want to see some of those values that I grew up with reestablished in such a way where it doesn't feel like it's an outlier, but it's something that will enable us to, on a regular basis, maintain our community health, maintain our personal health, our emotional and psychological health, so that we can have a greater and more vibrant Philadelphia. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jerome, for talking with us about the human-centric aspect of environmental justice and how what's happening in the environment impacts us, and as well as the interconnectedness of issues of human health, environment, and other aspects of life. So before we go to questions, I encourage you, we already have a couple of questions in the chat, and I encourage you all to continue to put those in. We'll get to as many as we can. But before we go to questions, I wanted to share one last resource with the Penn community, and that's Nature RX at Penn. The idea behind Nature RX is to write prescriptions for people to be out in nature, since research has shown, as we've talked about today, that time spent in nature can have a positive impact on health by reducing stress, anxiety, increasing energy, and giving us protective restorative time. So this program is based on a successful model from Cornell University. And even though we're on an urban campus, there are many opportunities to get out in nature quickly in the area. Penn's campus is actually an accredited arboretum, and the link on the slide, on the side of this with the QR code on the prescription card will take you to a Google map which highlights parks, gardens, and other green spaces around campus, where you can soak up some of the nurturing properties of nature. So I encourage you all to check that out. So now I want to thank everyone who has put their questions into the chat already. We'll now take some questions from the audience, and please continue to type those questions in. We also welcome you to connect with us after today's conversations, and you can find contact information for each of the panelists on this screen, and you can also contact Penn Sustainability at sustainability@upenn.edu with any questions. So now I will start with our first question, which is to Ms. Keisha Hewling. Can you speak more about the amount of trees planted that produce food or edible produce and potential barriers to planting these kinds of trees?
Sure. So I can say that UC Green is an organization under the Tree Tenders program, plants street trees. And so we do, we occasionally have some fruit-bearing trees like service berries, but we have heard neighborhood feedback and sentiment around concerns around harvesting the fruit-bearing trees, and so residents are able to select a tree. I'm thinking right now there are apple trees and persimmon on Baltimore Avenue, but that is at the selection or the choice of residents. The Philadelphia Orchard Project, or POP, and along with many of our local community gardens, have a keen eye and intention on planting fruit-bearing trees within kind of a pop-up or a small orchard setting. Thinking of Holly Street Neighbors Community Garden, we have 2 pawpaws and a persimmon that are going in this fall. There's a peach tree there. And so community gardens, which also, is to promote the importance of community gardens. But community gardens are a great place to find fruit-bearing trees that kind of moves them away from the walking path, because there is neighborhood sentiment, some thoughts around having fruit-bearing trees and the animals that they may invite, the cleanup that might be involved if you don't harvest them in a timely way and they fall, and things that can create a bit of a mess street side. Also, Tree Philly, through the Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, the Tree Philly program offers, and they're actually currently offering, fruit-bearing trees as part of their yard tree program. And so those are trees that can be planted by residents on private property, be it a church, a home, a daycare center, that moves them a little bit away from the walking path, and moves them away from being street side, which allows for a wider species selection. And so I know that they have pears and plums and really great fruit-bearing trees that are on their list right now, and they're actively looking for, they're accepting applications for pickup and for delivery of free yard trees. So, yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm salivating over here thinking about the fruit trees. So that's great. Thank you, Keisha. Our second question is, I had never considered the barrier of property owners dictating greening of our communities and the subsequent health impacts this gatekeeping holds. So to Ms. Keisha Hewling again, what can renters do to encourage property owners to plant trees? I know you spoke about this being policy being a big barrier here, but what can actually renters do? I think this is coming from a renter.
Yeah, and I understand that sentiment of gatekeeping, right? Because the decision making lies with them, and a lot of times developers, property managers, landlords own multiple properties, and so they're making those decisions. One of the things that I will say is that in my experience, the barrier for them is I I can opt for this tree. I don't know at what point this tree will become a headache for me because I'm not physically at that property and I can't speak to the maintenance of the tree. And so there are two things. So UC Green works to offer some basic maintenance services like our seasonal pruning through our pruning club, which makes sure that trees grow in a harmonious way that doesn't impede the walking path or obstruct parking, that people aren't just like snapping or pulling at the tree to remove limbs, but doing that in a safe way that doesn't make a tree more susceptible to disease, and ultimately to have that tree fail. As a renter, one of the most powerful things that you can do is to say, I want a tree, and collectively say that. And so whether that's just some letter signing and getting that going in the building. I've also seen at some of our some spaces where we have street trees planted, and just in West Philly in general, residents get together and they identify, like, we want a tree, and also we're going to be, we'll be the caregivers for the tree. We understand that trees are going to need regular watering. They're going to need some pit care and pruning, and they're going to need to have the tree pit de-weeded and trash removed from it, and we're up for that. Signed, the residents. And so that endorsement of, like, we will take on this responsibility and we will care for this tree is encouraging. On the renter level, I want to go back and emphasize, I think that just as a policy, that property owners being the only folks that can sign off for the tree, I think the issue lies there. But while that is the issue afoot, the best thing you can do is to advocate. Reach out to your local tree tenders, or also primarily reach out to your landlord directly and tell them that you want more trees in your property. Yeah.
Great. I think we'll take one last question since we're coming to the end of the hour here. And I think, Keisha, you kind of spoke a little bit about this already, but this is to all panelists. I am a current graduate student at Penn, and although I may only be here for a short period of time, I'm very passionate about environmental justice rooted in community work. How can I and others like me get connected to your work and further support the efforts discussed in your presentations? For anyone.
Well, I'll be very quick. I'll say you can volunteer with UC Green. On our website, there's a volunteer sign up. We have a whole host of interns that do longitudinal projects over a period of time. We also have folks that might just sign on for one day to, like, plant a tree or clean some tree pits. So you can always sign up with us.
And I'll say also that the similar invitation, the Overbrook Environmental Education Center has a number of environmental justice programs that we're connected to with regards to the city and the state. And as far as the city's concerned, last year we were able to successfully encourage the city to establish an environmental justice commission. And so you can reach out to the Office of Sustainability from the city of Philadelphia, and quite frankly, there's an opportunity to become an actual member of that board because it's forming at this point. So reach out to the Office of Sustainability in the City of Philadelphia, or you can reach out to the Overbrook Center, Environmental Education Center. We can give you contacts accordingly.
And then I can just quickly add, if there's anyone that has any interest in the research aspect of things, you can check out the Urban Health Lab website and see some of the projects that we have going on now. And there's an email on there for contact if anyone is interested.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. And a special thank you so much to our speakers, Dr. South, Keisha, and Jerome, for educating and empowering us to drive change in our communities. I'd also like to thank Elizabeth Main from Penn Sustainability for supporting and organizing and logistics for the event, Provost Wendell Pritchett's office for sponsoring Climate Week and this event, and Campaign for Community for supporting with event marketing and outreach, as well as Simon Richter again for all your efforts in organizing Climate Week and inspiring participants across campus to put on events and attend a wide array of events. So again, this event was recorded, and the recording as well as other resources will be available on Penn Sustainability's page. So please check out our website over the next few days for that. And thank you all again for joining us today. And I hope this has inspired you to action.